This is a VHS cassette that was originally purchased from Baker's on the High Street in Aldridge, called Aldridge Memories. It was compiled, according to the back, in 1998. I put a post on Aldridge Now and Then, and then Ian Eaton contacted me and transferred it to digital. But that post generated lots of interest in people saying they'd like to see it, like to watch it. So a few days ago, I actually met John Sale, who the photographs are taken from the John Sale collection, and he gave his blessing for us to put it up onto YouTube, so as I say, more people could enjoy it. There's also other credits on here. The voice presentation is Stan Brookhouse, research Don Heitzman, and the video production was Ronald Smith, who I haven't managed to speak to as yet. So it's exactly as came on the VHS tape, so enjoy.
We are approaching the end of a century of rapid change. For the young, change is the essence and inspiration of life. But as we get older, the confusion created by change is tempered by past memories. The places and people we knew in the past are sources of our knowledge and pleasure, and that is our aim in making this video, Aldridge Memories. We thank you all for helping us to record a part of our local heritage, and we hope that we've been able to add to your enjoyment of the area in which we live. In its earlier years, the centre of the village was almost entirely made up of cottage dwellings, but particularly over the last 100 years, these have been forced out with the increase of business and commercial interest, and the building of purpose-built premises. Some former dwellings in Anchor Road, now adapted to business use, have survived. An aerial view of the centre of Aldridge in 1963. Northgate and other roads radiate from the island. The railway is to the right, and the Croft right top centre, and right bottom centre is Anchor Meadow. The post office moved to these premises in Anchor Road in the 1920s from the Crook cottages in High Street. Do you remember the red telephone box? The year is 1969, and this flowering cherry tree in Anchor Road was once in the front garden of Howard Myron's bungalow. View in the early 1980s, looking across the island towards the Midland Bank. Holmbell House nearing completion in 1988, viewed from the roof car park of Anchor Parade. Changes are taking place to reduce the island and to improve the traffic flow. Photograph from the tower crane used in the construction of Holmbell House, we look down on Northgate. It was the first major road built in Aldridge since the end of the Second World War. The post office buildings are bottom right, and Cannock Chase can be seen in the far distance. These advertising hoardings occupy the site of the former Swan Inn in High Street. Here displaying politicians' promises in the forthcoming general election of May 1997. The Anchor Inn at the junction of Leeswood Road and High Street in the early 1900s, named in documents as early as 1673. The land at the rear had stables for Wakeman carriers. It closed as an inn in the late 1930s. Probably built in the early 19th century, the Swan Inn in High Street was empty when seen here in 1967. It had been a popular venue for local clubs and societies. Next to the Swan Inn were these premises, a cafe run by Mrs. Cooper and the hairdressers by husband Jack. The year is 1975. The Swan Inn has gone, and soon these buildings would disappear. The first stage in providing Aldridge with new shops began in 1959 in Croft Parade. This view was taken in 1983. The Co-op had built 3 grocery shops in Aldridge, one in Station Road, one in Leeswood Road, and the most recent one in Aldridge High Street. This picture with the staff standing outside the shop was taken shortly before its closure in September 1982. The old elms in High Street, situated opposite Baker's Lane, pictured here in the early part of the 20th century. The parish church can be seen in the background. From the end of the World War II, the former inn, the Elms, had become dangerous, and in 1954 a decision by the council to demolish it was made. It is seen here in the first stages of demolition. Looking towards the top of High Street in 1970, we see Ted Buckley's bakery shop. It was the oldest shop in the village, but soon to become Harmony Furnitures. B.J. Bakers have used 3 different premises in the High Street. In 1975 they occupied these premises, previously Madeley's electrical shop. In 1964 Bakers occupied these premises and traded as Bakers Typewriters and Office Supplies. Looking down Rookery Lane from High Street in 1968, with Aston's Cake Shop and Bakery on the right, and beyond the large tree we now have Quick Safe Supermarket. And the assembly rooms can be seen in the far distance. And in 1970, with Aston's Cake Shop and Bakery gone, we await the construction of the present-day Job Centre. A view across the Croft from Rookery Lane to Portland Road in 1962. The white-fronted buildings have now gone, and trees to the left shelter the cottage in the corner of the Croft. Arthur Thomas opened this greengrocer's shop in one of the Crook cottages in High Street in the 1950s. Harmony Furnitures, originally a dwelling house in the early 1900s. It had been Whitehouse's drapery shop, and it was the only place in Aldridge to obtain off-the-peg suits. Later to include grocery supplies run by daughter Nina. This row of cottages date in late 18th century, and the one nearest was known as Manor Cottage. It was occupied during the 1850s by the village surgeons and later by the farm bailiff for Squire Edward Tong. Although many of the Aldridge's old and interesting buildings in the village were lost during the 1940s and up to the 1960s, some thankfully still remain. Although there had been dwellings on this site in the 17th century, Aldridge Lodge, just off Bosty Lane, as seen here, had been built in 1783. It was owned in 1863 by Frederick Clark, whose sister Constance painted this beautiful watercolour. Bill Hartshorn, with his new Hercules bicycle, pauses to have this photo taken in front of this railway cottage in Station Road. This view from the top of the Avion in 1998, showing the Nat West Bank, gives us a location for the following picture, taken some 50 years earlier. And it's Ernie Elson's cycle shop in 1948, showing bicycles for sale in his front window, and the 2 petrol pumps to supplement his cycle business. The old assembly rooms in Rookery Lane can be seen at the top right of this picture. Up to the 1930s, police courts were held at Rushall, and Aldridge Police Station was a front room in Walmer Villas in Leeswood Road. The present police station, seen here in the 1950s, was built in 1938 and also provided us with a magistrate's court. Number 1 Leeswood Road, built in the 1850s and known as Manor House, used as a doctor's home and surgery for a number of years. Also dated mid-19th century, the Populous in Leeswood Road on the left was a former resident of William F. Clark, who was a mining engineer and who managed Aldridge Colliery. And on the right, the Limes, the late home of retired farmer Walter Gretton. In 1974, when Leeswood Road was being demolished to develop the area, one elderly resident, Mr. Bayliss, aged 79, refused to move, and plans for the new Alan Collins factory had to be adapted to fit the standing cottage. Lee House, pictured here in 1987 in Leeswood Road, close to the village. It was the 19th century home of the Prophet family, who were farmers and maltsters. At the junction of Noddy Park Road and Leeswood Road, these cottages seen here in 1989, with Rose Cottage on the right. A Noddy cottage left was used as an home guard base in the Second World War. The Aldridge Youth Theatre, an attractive, functional modern building, erected in 1977, and the opening ceremony was performed by the actor Bernard Epton. Easily recognisable, although seen here in 1973, is the Manor House, which was built in 1824 on the site of a former manor house, owned by first the Croxalls and later the Tongue family, who were squires of Aldridge. This cottage in Rookery Lane stood next to the assembly room, and it was occupied in the 1920s by the Humphreys family. Mr. Humphreys was Virgin Sexton at the Aldridge Parish Church. Here we see his daughter Winnie sitting on the garden wall. The Assembly Rooms, Rookery Lane, in 1967, built originally as a barn and purchased in 1922 by the Aldridge Conservatives. It served as a village hall until 1969. On the site of where Aldridge Library stands today stood this building, seen here in the early 1920s. It was the headquarters of the Conservative and Unions Club. It was demolished in 1928 when the club moved to its present premises in Portland Road. One of the earliest residences in Western Lane was Western House. Recently, new dwellings have been erected on land at the rear of Western House. Known as Ivy Cottage for obvious reasons and standing in the corner of the Croft close to Erdington Road, this cottage was in danger of demolition in the 1960s when a new ring road scheme was planned. This advert for a property sale appeared nearly 200 years ago for a small farmstead in Erdington Road, owned by William Simpkin and known later in the 19th century as Shelley's Buildings. They were demolished in the 1930s. Some locations around the village, though seemingly unspectacular, do reveal interest. A winter scene of 1947 in Anchor Road, looking towards the railway bridge, and middle right the entrance to the station yard and sidings. The gentleman in the foreground is Bill Howarth, who was the manager of Harper's Garage in Anchor Road. Seen here in 1972, the old James Hill Garage in Little Aston Road, offering for sale UK petrol. And with the development of Baytree House site, the road today has a more open aspect. Known as Back Lane, this connected Chester Road near the Plough and Arrow with Golfane Lane and Obsole Lane, a very convenient route for the 18th and 19th century drovers, with a watering place near Obsole Lane. The Anchor Brook in Anchor Meadow, which eventually joins the Tame Brook, flowing under the bridge in Walsall, originally flowed from Pool Green in Aldridge in the 18th century. During the summer of 1998, part of the front drive of 143 Leeswood Road sank, revealing this brick-lined structure. The farmland at this point had been known as Pumptree Field, and in the 1930s there still existed at this spot a wooded barrelled pump, very disused. Not effectively filled in when the houses were built in the late 1930s, but now properly filled in. We see the Lazy Hill Club in the distance, once called Pennard House. Early this century, looking up Lazy Hill Road, and in the right distance, Druids Heath House. The lady and child, however, are anonymous. It's hard to imagine double-decker buses travelling this road today. In 1846, there were plans for a railway, the Birmingham, Lichfield and Manchester Company, to pass through the parish with the provision of a railway station at Mill Green. But these came to naught, and we had to wait until 1879 when the Midland Railway opened its line for passengers from Walsall to Birmingham via Aldridge. Aldridge Station in 1967, already closed for passenger service. In 1910 there were 15 trains a day from Walsall to Birmingham, stopping at Aldridge, with 4 trains on Sundays. The station was demolished in 1970. Steam locomotives were in constant need to top up their tender with water from this large water tank, a problem in winter time, which required a brazier kept alight underneath the tank to prevent the water freezing in the tank. This 1970 view from the crossing at the end of the platform, where during the late 1890s several people lost their lives and misjudged speed or failed to notice the oncoming train. The Aldridge to Walsall platform was provided with its own ticket office to save passengers having to cross the lines from the main building. The last station master, Ernest Rhodes, stands behind the lady portress, Beryl Brookhouse, with a porter and Mr. Jones. Just a few years before the passenger service closed in 1965. This steam passenger train approaches Dumbledore Bridge on its way to Aldridge Station in 1959, with flats in Bonner Grove in the background. Aldridge was never a centre for the coaching trade, being bypassed by main highways, such as the Chester Road. Long-distance travellers in the late 18th century could, however, use the Wakeman carrier wagons based at Anchor Yard in Aldridge and reach London or Chester. In 1870, people could travel to Walsall by horse-drawn omnibus. The motor buses came in 1920. Plans in the 1950s for a new bus station in Aldridge to hold 14 buses never materialised. In 1968 we see the number 6 Aldridge to Walsall bus in Anchor Road. These 3 Harper coaches line up outside Druce Heath School in September 1956, ready to take 88 boys and staff to the Gower Peninsula for a holiday. A Midland Red Chase Rider, or the Bendy bus, negotiates Northgate Island in Leeswood Avenue in July 1984. They were not successful on these routes due to the locking up on Tide Bend. They were eventually shipped out to Australia. This Cessna 172 aircraft crashed into this house at Follery Brook in April 1966, killing both pilot and passenger, having lost its way in poor weather conditions. Jim Williams with horse and cart set off to deliver fresh baked bread from Aston's bakery in the early 1950s. And in the late 1950s, this Aston's delivery van has replaced the horse and cart. Mr. Betts stops his lorry near the Manor House to deliver a stone bottle of all white dandelion and burdock pop to a customer in the Crook Cottages in High Street during the 1950s. Up to 200 years ago, Aldridge was almost entirely devoted to farming, the land east of a line from Barbeacon to Walsall Wood being light and well drained, and ideal for arable farming, especially for the production of barley. Of the 40 or so farms which existed at the start of the present century, only 3 remain today. This barn in Bosty Lane referred to in early documents as Cornick's barn, when built in 1795. Tiles for the roof were bought from Newcastle, probably via the Worley and Essington Canal. The porch entrance is unique in Aldridge. a small farmstead in Leeswood Road, in the region of Pavilion Close, a small acreage of land which produced food and milk for the Ralb Orphanage up to 1936. Later it was owned by Mr. Swain, a local dairyman. Grange Farm, located where Walton Road meets Northgate, built by Mr. Jobins, whose brickworks were nearby. Note the quarry, close to. On the edge of the parish boundary with Walsall Wood stands this building, recently refurbished and known as Kingate's Farm, but non-dwellings, used as a farm up to 1939, and then became the premises for Stinchcombe and Cooper, who were engineers. Children of the Bannister family in Rookery Farm Yard in the 1920s. The goat most likely was provided for the children's own farming activity. Cartinet on Oud Walton's farm, Bar Common, in the 1930s, on what appears to be the last load. After some weeks, this field most likely would provide a second crop, the aftermath. An excellent example of the thatcher's art. These 5 circular stacks in the late 1940s on land now part of Druids Heath Golf Course. Mccormick's Reaper first appeared at an exhibition of 1851 at Hyde Park. From 1880 it became known as a binder, when means of tying sheaves was affected. 3 horses were normally required to pull this machine. Still on Walton's farm, probably in the 1940s, horses give way to the Fordson Model N tractor, the most popular tractor in Britain up to 1950. And an harvest field in Little Aston Road, 1996. A combine harvester has replaced the binder, the thrashing machine, and the jobs of many of the farm workers. The building of the Worley and Essington Canal in the late 18th century made easy the carriage of heavy materials, such as limestone, coal and bricks, and gave an added impetus to the exploitation of the natural resources in Aldridge by quarrying and mining. Limestone works depicted by Constance Clark in 1862. She lived at Aldridge Lodge. This painting shows clearly 2 shafts into the workings. Limestone was of good quality, suitable for cement. The site is now a conservation area, and little remains of the workings. The area is now maintained by the Walsall Council. Hayhead limestone was sufficiently important to warrant the construction in 1793 of a canal from Catshill Brownhills to carry away the product. This was a branch of the Worley and Essington Canal. Some of the brickworks remain at the end of the canal, where the narrowboats were loaded. On land just off Brickyard Road was this field and colliery spoil heap, and to the right the Midland Railway branch line to Walsall Wood. Local boys were granted permission to play football on the field by the colliery manager, a Mr. Clark. Aldridge number 1 colliery, or dry bread as it was known, viewed from Boatman's Lane. The shaft was sunk in 1874, and it was the last working colliery in Aldridge, closing in 1936. And here we see the remains of the Leeswood colliery, or the Aldridge number 2, seen in 1963. It had closed in 1930. The old London North Western rail link had passed to the right of the building. Brickyards of the Aldridge Brick, Tile and Coal Company in the 1920s. Near to the site of Aldridge number 1 colliery, we see the Midland Railway wagons. Moving to the left, the Cowley of Aldridge Brick, Tile and Coal Company. It was a company that was formed in 1930, taking over assets of the Aldridge Colliery Company, and then to concentrate on brick production, as shown here. And a view of the same brickworks, but from Brickyard Row, showing kilns along the side of the road. Looking from the canal towards Stubbers Green across the clay hole of Barnet and Beddoes brickworks, established about 1900 and known as the Atlas Works. They produced high-quality blue bricks, which were exported all round the world. In this view of 1984, the cooling towers of Walsall Power Station can be seen in the distance. The clay hole of the Utopia Works has reached exhaustion. Here in 1998 we see conservation taking place to stabilise the steep quarry sides near to the Walsall Wood housing. The Viger Works of the Jobbins family on the north side of Coppice Lane. It was the last brickworks to open, but owing to inferior clay, it was never successful. Tilers from the other Jobbins brickworks at the south side of Coppice Lane, where Do It All is today. Pictured in the 1940s, these men are all local and include Mr. Hughes, Nobby Brookhouse, and Bailey Milner, who's sitting at the front. Just about the last of the old Jobbins brickyard buildings to survive and used by car breakers until 1997. Now demolished and the land awaits development. Getting rid of rubbish by filling in the old Jobbins clay hole, and was then controlled by Midco in 1975. The Ipstock Group rebuilt brickworks in Brickyard Road, and later in 1990 built new brickworks on virgin land to the left of Stubbers Green Road. Dumbleberry Farm, extreme left, has now gone. Hardly recognisable as an industrial site, Branton Hill is seen here in 1988. The extraction of sand and gravel began in 1932 and ceased during the war due to the slackening off of the building industry. Aldridge Tool and Engineering Company in Western Lane was set up in 1920 by Herbert Clay, after a previous venture in a Birmingham factory that was burnt down. Industry spread to the airport site in the late 1930s, when Walsall Corporation provided premises for Heliwells to set up aircraft components and repair facilities, which continued until 1955. Post-war saw great industrial expansion in Middlemore and Westgate areas. This aerial view of McKechnie's Brothers' factory for brass extrusions, and the distant winding canal follows the land contours. The BRD set up in the 1950s, then employing 1,000 workers, engaged in making turbine blades for gas turbines, requiring great precision. The development of Aldridge as a village and then a town no doubt owes its origin to the 13th century location of its oldest building, the Aldridge Parish Church of St Mary the Virgin. A print of about 1800 showing the parish church before major rebuilding and the addition of the north aisle. Another watercolour of Constance Clark of the parish church in 1861 from within the croft, 3 years after the new north aisle was added. Further left is the barn of the manor farm. Thomas Davil in 1694 left land in Bosty Lane, and from the rent of 26 shillings per annum provided 6-penny loaves a week for the poor and aged, who attended both service and sermon. This bread box can be seen today on entering the parish church. The 19th century lich gate to shelter waiting funeral parties, at a time when clocks and watches were rare. Non-Anglicans would hold burial service here before interment in the graveyard. The position of the war memorial in the churchyard was not ideal for an armistice service. It was repositioned in open space on the croft in 1956 and is now more suitable for the annual Remembrance Day parades. The church tower is the oldest part of the church, originally held 5 bells, cast at Gloucester and hung in 1738 and recast in 1935. A 6th bell was added, the cost borne by the Tibbets family. Here in 1977 the crane lifts an additional bell into place. At the turn of the 19th century, 1 acre of the cemetery was set out beyond the rectory garden. This building formed the entrance and served purpose of the enclosed lich gate, dated 1908 and refurbished in 1985. Before the Second World War, the main growth in Aldridge was southwesterly, then named New Aldridge. To serve the population, St Mary's Mission in Tynings Lane was erected in 1935. Further growth in the 1960s across Druids Heath was provided for with the establishment of St Thomas's Church in 1970. In the early 19th century, Methodists met in a licensed cottage in High Street, where Baker's shop is today. This blue brick Wesleyan chapel was built in Leeswood Road in 1851, much to the annoyance of the rector. It was demolished in the late 1930s. Within the Wesleyan chapel, this small congregation ranged in front of the pulpit in the late 1920s, including the Walton brothers and the Wright family from Leeswood Road. The plaques left John Butler, died in 1913, and Wright Jabez Evans, organist, died aged 27. The Reverend Stanley Aberwhite stands in front of the manse of the Anchor Road Church in 1989. The manse was erected for the minister in 1947. It was sold and demolished for the new Safeway superstore and car park. The Anchor Road church, now greatly refurbished in 1994, with new roof and porch added. Was the roof tiling pattern to reflect W for Wesley? St Mary of the Angels Roman Catholic Church in Whetstone Lane, completed in 1963. The church rooms on the site previously used as a church. It was formerly the residence of Frederick Dewsbury. In the early 18th century, two reverend gentlemen, Thomas Cooper and John Jordan, were moved to provide education for boys of the parish, when land was reserved to provide funds to establish a free grammar school on the green, close by the parish church, an area which developed and extended through the years and is still providing schooling for the young children of today. The building nearest is the old Aldridge Endowed Boys' School in 1970, part of which was built in 1851, costing £160, to a design by Thomas Greensill of Great Worley. The carriage of materials was given by the farmers of the parish. The school was extended in 1894 and again in 1912. The old church rooms in 1966 was in existence by 1841 and then used as a girls' school. The boys still being taught at the old free grammar school. In later years, the church rooms were used for medical inspections. A group of Aldridge schoolgirls photoed on the green in 1940 with headmistress Miss Orme, centre, the second row. Easily recognised are Margaret Barnett, Nadine Satchwell, Meg Jukes, Ethel Thomas, Joan Mycock, Fanny Portman and Ruby Archer. The Infant School Jubilee Year, 1935. Mrs. Long left. Miss Brown, Governess Wright. 6 and 7 year olds include Stanley Brookhouse, Peter Cox, Peter Foden, Derek Oyton, John Swan and Doreen Davis. The Cushion Group in the early 1950s. The instruments include tambourines, cymbals and castanets. Having taught infants from the 1920s, Miss Bircher, now Mrs. Newell, seen with their class, backed by one of the post-war buildings. At the rear of the old Endowed Boys' School, these boys' football team in the late 1940s left Harold Tyus, who was the headmaster from 1942 to 1951. He was the founder of the school PTA, a councillor and a county magistrate. And on the right, teacher Frank Bailey, who was a keen cricketer. And a boys' school football team of 1953, with Bob Patterson, one-time deputy head of the school. A group of Cooper and Jordan school children in 1997. Leeswood School, originally the Aldridge County Secondary Modern. The school opened in 1953 and became a junior school when the new Tynan School opened. Maypole dancing celebrates the coming of summer. The Ralb Orphanage, Leeswood Road, at the early part of the 20th century. A close-up of the foundation stone of the orphanage. It was built during the winter of 1903 and 1904. and was opened by the Lord Chief Justice Lord Ulverstone in April 1904. A group of boy and girl orphans in the 1920s. The boy ringed in the front row is Edward Marshall, who revisited Aldridge in 1993, aged 80. The orphanage was sold up in 1936 and the pupils moved to Harrogate. The orphanage was taken over by the Home Office in 1938 and run by Dr. Barnardo's as an approved school. The pupils were kept busy at all times and there was strict discipline. The cook preparing a meal of sausages. Could that be a joint for the staff on top of the oven? This large country residence, known as the Mansion in Stonor Road, was taken over to expand the approved school and was called the Annex, now enlarged into Richard House. The approved school management discussing the affairs of the school. On the left, Mr. Rees, the headmaster, and on the right, Miss Robson, the matron, and centre, Dr. John Sterling. November 1962, and a visit by Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon, the occasion to open an extension to the main building. People make the place, some leaving their marks more than most. The stern-looking, the Reverend William Cowley, a man of many parts. He was a trustee of the Free Grammar School, owner of private schools, Copy Hall and Shutcross House. He was the second master of Queen Mary's Grammar School, and from 1838 he was the vicar of Rush Hall. Staff of the Clark family of Aldridge Lodge, just off Bosty Lane, most of whom would live in. 3 male members appear to wear some kind of livery jacket. The Clark family left the lodge in 1902 after the death of Frederick Clark. Aldridge became part of Walsall Rural District in 1894. And in the election that followed, 12 candidates put up for election, 6 of whom here were sponsored by the Unions Club and were successful, doubling the vote of the losers. John Manford, on the right, was the tenant of Drewsheath Farm from 1890, seen here about 1916, with his wife Margaret and granddaughter Kath, who today, aged 87, lives at Scarborough. Another farming family, the Bannisters, in front of the Rookery Hall, about 1910, soon after taking over the farm. No doubt who is the master. Dr. Moody, nearest the car, was our local Aldridge doctor during the 1920s. Walter Brown, grocer by profession, devoted his life to the service of others. He was the founder and chairman of the Over 60 Club, a Methodist church trustee, superintendent of the Sunday School. He died in 1968, sadly missed. Ernie Elson started in business as a cycle repairer in a small tin shed in the 1920s. He later moved to premises where the NatWest Bank is today. He's seen here with his daughter Anne in 1948. The actress Isabel Dean, seen here with Robert Morley in the film The Story of Gilbert and Sullivan. She was born in Aldridge in May 1918 and lived in High Street. She enjoyed success on stage and screen. Her first stage appearance as a child was in 1928. It was at a concert in the Assembly Rooms. She died in 1997. Ben Clare, black suit, arms folded, middle left of this picture, found work for many local miners who were out of work during the pit strike of 1926. In pre-television and certainly pre-radio days, people organised their own entertainment, and there was much in order to satisfy one's varied tastes, be they energetic or sedate. An Aldridge rugby team on the Anchor Meadow in 1938, where they played by kind permission of Mrs. Cook, who then owned Anchor Meadow. 3 young men, Reggie Aldridge, David Partridge and Ray Turner, are recognised in the team. Over the past years, Aldridge has been noted for having good hockey teams and players, and no one more talented than Harry Baker, centre front row in this picture. Goalkeeper Harry played for his county and enjoyed his game into his 60s. Female representative of Aldridge nationally in recent years is Fiona Moray in the sport of basketball, having trained over 4 years at Santiago. One highlight of her career was in 1992 when she won a Commonwealth gold medal in Edinburgh. International caps to date total 72. She was educated at Red House and Tyne schools. Local teenager boxer Lee Hallett hoped to represent Britain at the Sydney Olympic Games in the year 2000. He has already won ABA and NAB titles, as well as a silver medal boxing for England in America in 1997. He was the youngest Walsall Sporting Personality of the Year in 1996. He was then aged 15. The Aldridge British Legion football team, Councillor Edgar Swain, Ernie Holliman, Tom Millington and Derek Austin are recognisable. The Aldridge British Legion bowls team of the 1950s with Billy Slee, David Cleaver, Joe Milner, Harry Smith, Dempsey Astlow, Phil Papworth, Ted Shaw and Ernie Kimbley. An event which involves many of the Aldridge's running club, the 10-kilometre road race in May 1993, as they set off from by the Masonic Hall. The earliest report to hand in 1865, when a combined Aldridge and Little Aston cricket team played Willinghall in Little Aston Park. Here in 1948 are the first 11 Aldridge cricket team, with the president, Al Buckley, centre, who secured for the club its present cricket field. George Simmons, as a young Aldridge cricketer, had the pleasure of taking 4 wickets for 4 balls against a Russia team in 1951. George is seen here in 1996, holding the ball with which he achieved that notable feat. The Avian, almost ready for its opening in the summer of 1938. It was used as a cinema up to 1967. Attempts to update its facade as a bingo hall failed when permission was refused to replace the glazed tiling. The Avian as a cinema never reached decimalisation. These prices must represent seat charges in its later years. The cheapest front stall seats in 1953 were 1 shilling, or 5 new pence today. Looking down to the Anchor Meadow from the top of the Avey in September 1997, and the fair has arrived, but for how much longer, as work is due to commence shortly for the building of the Aldridge Medical Centre. After World War II saw a sudden rise in popularity of speedway racing, and Alexandra Stadium Paribas was always packed. These youths of Leeswood Road try to emulate their hero, Graham Warren, on land near Grange Farm, towards the end of the 1940s. As a teenager, Joan Lovelock used to take part in this horse-trotting, harness racing sport, having raced in Wales and Scotland for a number of years, winning several races. Joan is seen here in Noddy Park Road in the 1950s. Mr. Smith and his colourful garden in Redhouse Lane just after the Second World War. National celebrations were always reflected locally, and opportunities for local groups, church, school and societies to organise affairs, which in today's sophisticated high-tech world may seem to be simple and even quaint, but which to the participants and spectators of years long gone remain cherished memories. A view from the tower of the parish church of preparations on the Croft to celebrate the Jubilee in 1935 of King George V and Queen Mary, with a bonfire ready to be lit on the centre of the path across the Croft. Having assembled on the Croft, the children's procession set off past the Manor Farm, headed by a Scottish piper and young drummers. A smartly uniformed policeman sets the pace. Two years on, and children, this time in fancy dress, proceed along High Street for the coronation of King George VI in May 1937. Note the decorated bicycle in the form of a steamship. The procession returns to the Croft for the final judgment of the dress competition and sports, which were planned for later. Sadly, the junior sports were cancelled due to rain. And moving on to a carnival of the 1950s with the Queen Muriel Birch, a Maids of Honour and Sir Cliff and Lady Tibbets of Cedar Court, Aldridge, who were patrons of the carnival. A more formal event involving a procession through the village took place on an annual Civic Sunday parade, here in Anchor Road, passing the saluting base in front of the Council House. Councillor Richard Arkle officiates. The 1st of October 1958, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and wife Lady Dorothy head for the Over 60 Club in Leeswood Road. Councillor Edgar Swain conducts the party, which include local MP Sir Harry Goldsmith. The arrival of Princess Diana to open the new Cedar School in Leeswood Road in 1986. And the crowds in Leeswood Road on this memorable occasion. A close-up of Princess Diana as an onlooker attempts to shake her hand. And after the opening ceremony, Princess Diana about to depart. November 1994, 3 members of the Aldridge Parish Church journeyed to Romania with supplies, also the central heating boilers from the disused Cedar School, taken to a children's orphanage in Romania. Here we see Alan Pigeon, Len True and Colin Hill waiting at the border of Hungary for permission to cross into Romania. To those who lived through them, whether young or old, the 2 world wars created lasting impressions as they touched the lives of everyone. The Manor House during the First World War was used as an auxiliary hospital for the wounded soldiers. Here at the front of the Manor House are the soldiers and nurses. The Avian played an important part in stimulating public response in 1940 to raise funds to buy 1 Spitfire for the war effort. Unfortunately, the money raised was not quite sufficient. The unit of the Home Guard said to be the South Platoon, but of which company is not known. They are, however, posed in front of barns at Longwood Farm, just off Bosty Lane. Air raid precautions. The boys of the orphanage-approved school emerged from the air raid shelter, still wearing respirators. This must be early in the Second World War. Leeswood Avenue is in the background. The end of the Second World War, with people of Red House Lane, Aldridge, celebrating at this street party. And finally, the 1992 Armistice Remembrance Sunday at the Cenotaph, the service being led by the Reverend John Reeves of the Aldridge Parish Church.
Shall grow not old as we that are left go. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. The going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. And when you go home, tell them of us, and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today.